What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today I woke up, and you ever have one of those nights of sleep where basically you're just being resurrected in the morning? Like you're dead asleep, and then you just it's just like you got resurrected by God or something. But anyways, I had one of those nights last night. What are we talking about today?
Ryan, how would you make a case for the resurrection for somebody who does not believe the Bible is authoritative?
Say what now? Whew. Okay, let's do this shit. If you're interested in how Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, then please stay tuned.
Apologetics seeks to give credible answers to curious questions.
Ryan, how would you make a case for the resurrection for somebody who does not believe the Bible is authoritative?
Okay, so this is a short video. There might be a lot of pauses in what they say. They're probably going to say one or maybe two sentences, and then I'm going to stop. So just be prepared for that. So right here, it's proving the resurrection to people who don't consider the Bible to be reliable or authoritative. So you got to keep that in mind, okay? Now, here are some concessions I'm willing to make for this particular argument. I'm willing to give them Paul, because Paul was an actual historical figure that did write some things on his faith of Christianity. And there are some certain facts about Paul that I'll even concede, but we'll get to that later. The Gospels, anything else like that, that can't be used as evidence for this. So any of the information that's contained within the Gospels shouldn't be used as a fact or any kind of evidence of a resurrection.
That's a good question. I think a lot of Christians would be surprised to know that there's a lot of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.
No, there's actually not. Legit, the best evidence of a resurrection that I've heard comes from Frank Turek, who explains how the Pauline creed, the creed in, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 or something like that. That particular creed, I think, is the best evidence that you could get for a resurrection or something like that. Actually happening, I guess, because in that creed, Paul, he talks about Christ dying and being buried and then rising again. But even then, that's just Paul regurgitating what Paul already believes, what the faith tells him. And it's very important with Paul because you see, Paul vehemently denies that he gets his information from anybody here on earth. The only way that he gets his information is through a vision by Jesus Christ or through the scriptures. So all of his information comes from the scriptures or he hallucinated it. And this was common at the time because you were only considered an apostle like Paul and like Peter and like other people at the time. You were only considered an apostle if you had a vision of Jesus, not if you actually met Jesus in real life or anything like that. In fact, you couldn't have any information originating from earth or from people. It all had to come from the celestial realm, from Jesus himself. That was the only way you had authority to speak on Christian theology at the time.
What I'm about to say, I have to give credit to Gary Habermas. He's done a lot of work in this. And what he's done is he has dug around, done some research, found thousands of different scholars and sources in English, French, and German dating back to 1975. And what he found is virtually all scholars, Christian and skeptic alike, agree upon a certain number of facts.
Okay, so before he gets into the facts here, I would like to show how this is the start of the argument from authority. Now, a lot of people are confused by the argument from authority because a lot of people mistake it for the argument from false authority. That would be somebody that has authority in one field and gives an opinion on another field, and then somebody uses that opinion to prove their point. That would be an argument from false authority. But an argument from authority is mainly just citing the authorities that they all agree on this. It's a lot like the bandwagon fallacy. If all you're going to do is cite the fact that scholars all agree on these facts, then that doesn't mean that these facts are actually facts. You have to actually give evidence evidence for those facts being facts. You can't just say everybody agrees that this is the thing. You can't just say that and then expect it to be like a true statement.
One fact that is virtually certain is that Jesus died by crucifixion. That fact is so certain that even prominent skeptic scholar John Dominic Crossan, who wrote the Jesus Seminar movement, he admits that Jesus' crucifixion is as certain as anything historical can ever be.
Now, I do have to disagree with John Crossan on this, mainly because the evidence doesn't really seem to support the crucifixion being one of the most solidified things that we can be certain of or something like that in history. I disagree because the only evidence that we have that this so-called Jesus was actually crucified is Paul. That's literally the only evidence that we have. And even then, Paul doesn't say who crucified Jesus, just that he was crucified. And also, the whole dying and rising God thing kind of entails that the Messiah would be killed in order to resurrect and absolve sins and everything like that. That's already part of the motif. With crucifixion being a common execution style back then, it makes sense that they would assume that Jesus was crucified. There are other reasons why that I could get into as to why crucifixion was the chosen method for Jesus, being that crucifixion is a type of suspension punishment / execution method that was very common to the dying and rising God trend, which reaches all the way back to Anana, which I'm going to be putting together a video soon explaining that a little bit further, but I digress. The evidence for Jesus being crucified is very minimal. And to say that it is as solidified as anything that we can be sure of in history, I think is very disingenuous. Because for one, Paul was not a first-hand witness to this. It would be a lot stronger if Paul was our only reference to this and he actually saw it. But he didn't. See, Paul is only regurgitating what he already believes about the Messiah. Not that he actually saw the Messiah, just that he believes this to have happened. So this isn't actually evidence that he was actually crucified. It's just evidence of what Paul believes.
Secondly, Jesus' disciples believed that he rose again and had appeared to them. And if you read the end of the Gospels, you read this embarrassing stuff about them. They're scared, they're running, they're cowards, and then shortly thereafter, they're suddenly boldly preaching Jesus. We even read in history that they're willing to be killed for their belief in a risen Jesus.
Well, yes, but again, we're not counting what the Gospels and Acts say, because that's where you're pulling this information. You're pulling all of that extra information right there from the Gospels and Acts. Acts chronicles what happened to the apostles and the disciples, supposedly, after Jesus died and was resurrected. But you see, since we're not counting those, we're only counting Paul, I don't see how any of this is actual evidence of what you just said. And also, yes, the apostles believed that Jesus had rose again and had appeared to them because they had actually hallucinated them. And that was the only way that the apostles would ever know anything about this Jesus and his life and his teachings was if Jesus appeared to them. That was the only way that they could have authority to speak on these matters, to lay down theology, like new theology, like Paul. Paul never cites a human source. Paul even indicates that the only way that you can be an apostle is to get a revelation from Jesus about this information. And this actually coincides with the existing Jewish theology at the time. Because in the Jewish theology, you're not to trust the wisdom of man. You're only supposed to trust the wisdom of God. So the only way that you could know anything about this Jesus character was to get a revelation directly from him or God, whichever one you want to make Jesus out to be. This isn't actually evidence of an actual Jesus dying and resurrecting and all this other stuff. This is only evidence of what the apostles believed. It's just their mere belief in it. That's all. There's no actual evidence that can cement it into history.
Third, the tomb of Jesus was found empty. And we can be certain that it was empty because if it wasn't, the Jewish leaders would have been all too happy to march everyone back down to that tomb to show them Jesus' body to squelch the movement, which they very much wanted to do.
So this whole empty tomb business, like I said, the best evidence for it could possibly be Frank Turek's argument of 1 Corinthians 15:3 through 8 or whatever. That's the best evidence I think that they have, because the whole resurrection of Jesus thing after Paul says that he was buried, not entombed, mind you, but buried, anyways, kind of implies that, I guess that he wouldn't be there. But in any case, I'm willing to give Frank Turek and, other people like that, that their best evidence for that would be Paul talking about Jesus resurrecting after he was buried. But still, the whole empty tomb thing, that is not actually a thing. For one thing, buried doesn't mean entombed. For another thing, that is information from the Gospels, which you already said you wanted to try to convince somebody without using the Gospels or the Bible in general, because they don't consider it authoritative. So why would you bring up information from the Gospels in order to convince somebody that doesn't consider the Gospels reliable? I don't understand this particular tactic. It just feels like now you've run out of arguments that don't include the gospel, so you're just like, let's just not mention that this is the only place that is said to happen, that the empty tomb was found. Now, the empty tomb tradition does reach back as far as at least Mark, but even then, part of that story was considered embarrassing by the first century Christian. This would be the lack of post-resurrection appearances by Jesus, because at the original ending of Mark, the women run away scared, and they tell no one, which is kind of odd how the gospel came to be written if they didn't tell anybody about it, or at least that part of the gospel. But in any case, there was no tomb, at least in Paul's theology. There was just a burial. I don't know where they're actually solidifying this whole empty tomb thing in history, or how this could be considered a minimal fact of the historical Jesus, but there's literally no evidence whatsoever to actually place this in history.
And then fourth, the Christian persecutor Paul was converted to Christianity. So virtually all scholars agree upon those four historical facts.
Okay. I really don't care what historians agree on. I care about what the evidence actually supports. Now, normally, historians have evidence to support the things that they say. But as we have examined here with all four of your minimal facts, none of them are actually supported by evidence. And the fact that Paul converted? Are you fucking serious right now? People convert for bad reasons all the time. Also, if Paul was hallucinating like he most likely was, and Jesus told him to, believe in him and everything like that, I could totally understand Paul converting from being a Jew to being a Christian. I'm sure a ghostly Jesus appearing to you and telling you that you've been doing wrong and that you need to praise him, I'm fairly certain that would convince a lot of people. But still, the mere conversion of somebody who was a dick to the Jews, or the Jewish Christians rather, is not actual evidence that Jesus actually resurrected. The hallucination hypothesis is way more probable than your whole Jesus actually resurrected thing, because it's a natural explanation for the events that happened. Natural events will always supersede supernatural events in explanatory power.
Now, scholars who deny the supernatural, they'll have to come up with other alternative explanations.
Well, I agree, but I also don't think that they need to have these explanations fleshed out or fully supported or anything like that in order to disregard all of your non-evidence. Because, like I said, it's not evidence. Everything that you have pointed out is not evidence of an actual resurrection. So there's no way that evidence can be used to support an actual resurrection. Now, however lacking the current explanations, if Jesus was actually crucified and died, just because they lack a complete explanation for it, does not automatically mean that your supernatural explanation supersedes the explanatory power of the natural explanations. Because these explanations could look like fucking Swiss cheese. It doesn't matter, because they're natural explanations. Natural explanations will always supersede supernatural ones in explanatory power.
So one explanation is that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He merely passed out. But there's so many holes with that theory. Number one is we don't have any evidence of anybody ever surviving a crucifixion.
So if Jesus actually was crucified, then most likely he would have died. There are some instances in history where the person being crucified has been taken down off of his crucifixion tool, whether that be a stake or a wall or whatever. Like, they've been taken down and they've survived. But the primary purpose for crucifixion, especially Roman crucifixion, was execution. So I don't know why this is a fact to bring up, other than the fact that you don't have a lot of facts. So you have to kind of scrounge around to, conjure up facts in order to put here. But I mean, this isn't actually a hole, like you say, because if we can't trust the Gospels to give us an accurate account of what happened, then it's quite possible that he could have been crucified up on the cross and then for whatever reason taken down, because that could have possibly happened. That's a natural explanation, and it's always going to exceed the idea that Jesus rose from the dead to absolve the sins of humanity.
Number two, his disciples stole the body. But again, there's too many holes with that, because as we just said, Jesus' disciples were willing to die for this. Would somebody really die for a lie?
Oddly enough, I think the whole stealing the body thing is too improbable to have actually happened of the competing hypotheses for what happened to Jesus' body if the tomb was actually found empty. I feel like the passing out kind of thing is a lot more probable than this, primarily because, and I'm surprised he didn't go this route. Instead, he went the who would die for a lie kind of route. But see, if the tomb was actually empty and the Romans actually crucified him, then the Romans would have been the ones to go around searching, and he would have, the Romans would have rounded up all of his brocephs and everything like that, and they would have killed them. They would have found the guy that supposedly rose from the dead. That is a better tactic to take against this particular hypothesis than they would have just not died for a lie. Who dies for a lie? Well, I mean, you just validated the Islamic faith and pretty much any other religion out there that's persecuted. I mean, why would they die for a lie? Of course, I guess you could bring up the argument that, well, these people are already in the belief way after the belief happened, so they fully believe in it, which is my exact point for the people that are supposedly dying for a lie, because the disciples are not mentioned at all by Paul. That comes from the Gospels. Paul only references apostles. Now, as we discussed before, apostles were those that had hallucinated a risen Jesus. And that was the only way that they got their knowledge, that and scriptures. So they didn't actually see Jesus. And there's nothing in Paul that indicates that any of the apostles actually saw an earthly Jesus, let alone believed in an earthly Jesus. So the whole disciples dying for a lie thing doesn't actually make sense if you're trying to convince somebody that doesn't regard the Bible as authoritative. Now, like I said, I'm giving you Paul, and that actually hurts your case in this instance.
And so as you think about the four historical facts, the only theory that doesn't have any holes in it is that Jesus truly did rise again from the dead.
No, you see, that's a false dichotomy, I feel, because it's either Jesus definitely rose from the dead, or he just died and then there's all these holes. I feel like you're providing a false dichotomy here, because while, yes, one explanation is that Jesus actually rose from the dead, there are plenty of other hypotheses about it, giving you that Jesus was crucified and he died and was entombed. Like, if I give you that, there are plenty of other hypotheses out there that have way more explanatory power than the supernatural one, because, like I said before, natural explanations will always supersede supernatural explanations in explanatory power. So the supernatural explanation has no evidence in history whatsoever, as we've already covered here. You went through the four minimal facts that you've provided via Gary Habermas, which I'm sure that I've got a link somewhere to my playlist refuting Gary Habermas. But you provided those 4 minimal facts, and we actually showed how there's no evidence to support those being actual facts in history. All in all, I'm very unimpressed by this video and your tactic to try to persuade somebody that doesn't consider the Bible authoritative, because half of your evidence comes directly from the Gospels, which I thought that we weren't considering those particular bits of evidence because they're not reliable in this conversation. Well, I mean, they're not reliable all around in general, but for the purposes of this conversation, we weren't considering them, or at least I thought. So anyways, heathens, what I would love to hear from you down below is what you think about these 4 minimal facts that prove the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Do you think that they are actually evidenced in history, or do you think that they are very lacking in evidence? Let me know. Also, while you're down there, let me know what you think about the argument from authority. Do you consider it persuasive, or do you think that the authority should have evidence to back up their claims? I would love to hear from you guys down in the comments. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.